In the palaces of Persepolis, holiness had a price, measured not in gold, but in daughters. Each year, a new name was added to the king's ledger of purity, not as a birth, as an offering. The priests called it renewal. The scribes called it law. But archaeology calls it what it was. An empire that learned to sanctify possession. Who paid for the glory of divine order? The chronicles are silent, but the ruins answer. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledgers close, the bones still speak. By the 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire ruled more people than any kingdom before it, stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. To its subjects, Xerxes was not a man, but a miracle, the living instrument of Ahura Mazda, god of light and truth. His father, Darius the Great, had carved the empire's constitution into stone. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, I am King of Kings. Those 7 words fused religion with governance. Faith became law. Law became faith. To obey the king was to obey the divine. To defy him was to defy creation itself. This fusion of God and monarch gave birth to a theology of purity. The priests declared that divine blood must remain undiluted, that the royal line carried heaven's light within it. What began as a metaphor for moral order soon hardened into bureaucracy. The empire's scribes created blood ledgers, records listing each royal wife, concubine, and daughter according to their proximity to divine essence. Purity was categorized, updated, and taxed. The empire didn't worship, it administered. Surviving tablets from Persepolis show how holiness became logistics. One entry reads, "Oils for renewal, 2 jars, linen for offering, 6 rolls, myrrh for the vessel of light." They sound like temple supplies, but context shows these were not prayers. They were preparations. Each detail measured the price of ritual purity, a ritual that often ended where the records stopped. When a royal girl turned 13, the ceremony began. She was bathed in milk and honey, perfumed with saffron, her hair braided with pearls. Priests marked her brow and recited, "From the light of the king, life renews." Then she was taken into the chamber of illumination. The archives say only, "Offering completed." The words are bloodless, but the archaeology is not. Under the women's quarters of Persepolis, archaeologists have found combs burned black by fire, fragments of jewelry melted into the floor, and bone scarred by restraint. The empire never recorded these deaths, because it did not see death. It saw purification. What the modern mind calls violation, the Persians called renewal. Everything in Persepolis reinforced this theology. Corridors curved inward so that no one could see beyond. Doors locked from the outside. Hollow walls allowed guards to hear whispers. The king's chamber sat directly above the women's quarters, a structure that literalized divine hierarchy. Even the architecture worshipped him. The eunuchs, castrated to guard the royal line, became the empire's perfect servants. They carried ledgers instead of weapons, recording every ceremony in clean, silent handwriting. They were both witnesses and victims, mutilated so that the blood of others could remain pure. Their silence was policy, their obedience was faith. Around them, nobles offered daughters as proof of loyalty. Refusal meant rebellion. Submission brought favor. The priests blessed these exchanges as sacred covenants. The scribes called them entries of service. The empire didn't need chains, it needed paperwork. That was Persia's true genius. It made faith bureaucratic. Once devotion was documented, it became permanent. To outsiders, Persia looked enlightened. Roads paved, canals built, justice codified. Yet, within the palace, every reform served one goal: to preserve the king's sanctity. Even law, which once restrained men, now existed to glorify him. The Code of Darius had defined crime as disobedience. Xerxes perfected it. In his reign, the word impure became interchangeable with guilty. Under this system, no act was too cruel to justify. Priests rewrote language so that sin could serve the state. Obedience became worship. Fear became faith. And the silence that covered the palace was not absence. It was evidence of perfection. A world without dissent looked like peace. This was how the Persian Empire conquered not only nations, but morality itself. It taught that suffering could be sacred, that the body could be owned in the name of purity. Every citizen became a believer not by choice, but by design. The empire no longer needed belief, it needed compliance. From the marble reliefs that still decorate Persepolis, Xerxes stands eternal, tall, serene, surrounded by angels. Yet, beneath that stone calm lies an empire sustained by ritualized violation. The same theology that demanded divine blood for order would soon demand entire nations for glory. The ideology of purity that governed the harem would march to war under banners of faith. That is where our question begins. When holiness becomes law, does faith still protect life? Or does it merely protect power? In the empire of Xerxes, purity was not an aspiration, it was an operation. Every temple, office, and storeroom existed to maintain the illusion that the king's body and the kingdom's order were one and the same. Priests dictated theology, scribes codified it, eunuchs executed it. Each class dependent on the other, each bound by fear of what would happen if the illusion cracked. What began as faith had become infrastructure, a system built to convert devotion into data and belief into obedience. The palace of Persepolis was its beating heart. Every morning, clerks entered the archives to record offerings from across the empire. Incense from Babylon, gold from Lydia, lapis from Bactria, each shipment labeled for renewal. These tributes did not feed the people, they fed the myth. From that flow of wealth, the priests sustained the rituals that proved the king's divinity. The cycle was perfect. Faith financed the empire, and the empire financed faith. Within the women's quarters, that logic reached its most precise form. The harem was not chaos, it was administration. Women were arranged by lineage and assigned to hierarchies of purity. Each had a record, a room, and a schedule. Eunuchs carried tablets listing which chamber required oil, which needed musicians, which required silence. Bureaucracy ensured that even intimacy followed procedure. When a new concubine was chosen, her origin, diet, and rituals were logged. Her body became a document. The eunuchs, mutilated for loyalty, formed the system's nervous network. They filed reports on conduct, emotion, and fertility, translated not into gossip, but into statistics. A princess's mood might become a notation. Signs of resistance, prayer required. These reports moved upward to the priesthood, who reinterpreted them as moral warnings. In the empire of light, even sadness was a sin. No part of this machine functioned without belief. The priests were its engineers, shaping scripture to serve the throne. They proclaimed that Ahura Mazda's light flowed through the king, and that serving him was equivalent to serving the divine. Rituals were multiplied to reinforce this claim. Every night, fires burned in the temple to sustain the king's breath. Every dawn, hymns echoed through marble halls declaring, "As the king lives, so does creation." The words blurred faith and politics, until neither could exist without the other. Outside Persepolis, the same structure extended across provinces. Governors enforced purity codes, inspecting marriages, clothing, and festivals. Persian law required that every act of devotion be performed in the king's name. Even prayer was taxed. Each temple owed a tithe of its offerings to the royal treasury. The empire's god was not distant. It was administrative. To believe meant to pay. The propaganda of holiness filled every wall. Reliefs carved into stone showed Xerxes seated beneath winged angels, conquered nations kneeling before him. Artists exaggerated his height, his stillness, his symmetry. The image of the divine king was everywhere, yet nowhere human. The empire no longer worshipped a man, it worshipped an idea, that order itself was sacred. But the stronger the image, the deeper the fear. The priests whispered that a single impurity, a disobedient daughter, an unrecorded offering, could disturb the cosmic balance. That anxiety became policy. Inspectors roamed the harem searching for signs of defiance. Women were examined not for guilt, but for doubt. The empire had turned faith into surveillance. For Xerxes, this was power perfected. He had inherited an empire united by language and law, but he ruled it through perception. If people believed his holiness was fragile, they would protect it for him. So, he fed their fear. He performed purification ceremonies in public, burning incense over the bodies of slaves, washing his hands in milk, declaring himself clean before the nation. It was theater disguised as liturgy, propaganda disguised as prayer. Each act reminded Persia that the king's purity was the world's stability. The same theology that justified his private crimes now justified conquest. When Xerxes invaded Greece, he declared the campaign not a war, but a cleansing. The earth, he said, must be purified of rebellion. Soldiers marched under banners embroidered with fire and wings, the symbols of divine renewal. For every city burned, a prayer of purification was recited. The empire's bureaucracy followed the army. Scribes marched behind soldiers, recording loot as offerings. Priests consecrated bloodshed as sacrifice. In this way, conquest became ceremony, and mass death became evidence of divine favor. The ledgers of war resembled the ledgers of the harem, detailed, meticulous, indifferent. Yet behind the statistics, cracks began to show. Some priests, disturbed by what they saw, left subtle warnings in the margins of their records, scribbled lines like, "The fire burns beyond its altar." These fragments survived centuries because bureaucracy preserved everything, even doubt. In a system that worshipped documentation, dissent could only exist as footnote. When the invasion faltered, Xerxes did not see military failure. He saw impurity. The gods had turned their faces. not because he had sinned, but because others had. His priests encouraged the delusion. To restore balance, they urged new rituals, harsher purifications, and greater sacrifices. Every defeat became a reason for more control. Faith became the cure for the wounds it had caused. By then, the machinery no longer served religion. Religion served the machinery. The empire had achieved what every despot dreams of: a system so complete it could operate without conscience. Priests wrote scripture to explain cruelty. Eunuchs filed the evidence. Scribes buried it beneath beauty. The empire functioned like a prayer written in code, repeated until no one remembered its meaning. And so the question deepens. If holiness can be engineered, what happens when the engineer begins to believe his own design? When Persepolis burned, it was not only a city that fell, it was a theology. The empire that once claimed to embody divine order collapsed beneath its own perfection. Alexander's soldiers lit the torches, but the fire had begun years earlier, in the archives, when belief became bureaucracy and silence became survival. What burned that night was not marble, it was certainty. The priests fled with relics, clutching tablets that recorded ceremonies no one would ever perform again. Eunuchs died at their posts, guarding empty rooms filled with ash. The scribes who once documented purity now wrote inventories of loss: wine consumed, linen destroyed, temples extinguished. An empire that had catalogued every breath died exactly as it had lived, through documentation. Centuries later, when archaeologists sifted through the ruins, they found evidence arranged as carefully as any ritual. Crushed ivory, broken alabaster, oil jars sealed under collapsed walls. The skeletons of attendants still lay where they had knelt, facing the direction of the king's chamber. Even in death, the order held. The empire's precision had preserved its crimes. Each tablet, each carved line was an accidental confession, a civilization that mistook control for devotion and record-keeping for redemption. History tends to call this hubris, the arrogance of kings who claimed divinity. But Xerxes' sin was more systematic. He didn't destroy faith, he industrialized it. He made holiness measurable, transferable, taxable. He transformed worship into policy and turned God into governance. The machine he built was too perfect to die with him. When the flames consumed Persepolis, they did not erase the design. They scattered it. Because power remembers patterns better than people remember pain. The same architecture of belief, law justified by holiness, obedience disguised as virtue, survived long after the empire turned to dust. Every civilization that came after borrowed pieces of it. Rome, Byzantium, even the empires that called themselves enlightened. Each built their own version of the chamber of illumination, whether in marble halls or modern ministries. Each learned that once purity is written into law, cruelty becomes a maintenance cost. The ruins of Persepolis are quiet, but not empty. Step close, and you can still see fingerprints pressed into clay before it hardened. Scribes who never imagined their work would outlive their gods. The ledgers they left behind contain no prayers, no poetry, only arithmetic, quantities of oil, rations of grain, allocations of women. That was the language of divine order, measurement. Archaeology reveals something more unsettling than guilt: efficiency. The empire didn't collapse because it was cruel. It collapsed because it stopped knowing the difference between worship and management. When everything became holy, nothing could be forgiven. There was no mercy left to restore balance, no space for error in a system built on purity. And so the fire did what faith could not. It returned the empire to dust. The marble cracked, the gold melted, and the names of kings turned unreadable. Yet the system outlived them. In habits, in politics, in every society that calls its rules sacred. We still repeat the Persian pattern: control disguised as virtue, obedience rewarded as moral clarity. The tools are cleaner now: laws, flags, screens. But the logic is the same, because that's what Xerxes built. Not a palace, not a religion, but a blueprint, a method for converting fear into faith, record into ritual, domination into devotion. The empire of light learned to hide its darkness in procedure. And the modern world, for all its progress, still runs on those same ledgers. Only now the entries are digital. Persepolis burned, but its spirit never died. It survives wherever morality is weaponized, wherever order is treated as proof of righteousness. And every time a ruler speaks in the name of purity, the ruins whisper back through time. We have seen this before, because holiness, once written into law, never protects the living. It protects only the hands that claim to speak for them.